Hi, I'm Bobby Nash. I'm the author of 85 North, published by Falstaff Books. 85 North is a collection of short stories that I've written over the years, and I wanted to share one of them with you now. I share a story called Beyond the Horizon, which is one of my first forays into writing fantasy. It was a nice diversion, a nice experiment. Beyond the Horizon. Kelvin stared out at the horizon and felt the knot in his stomach tighten. It was not a new sensation. The knot first made its presence felt the day after he made his decision, and it had continued to grow tighter and tighter as the moment approached. In fact, he was beginning to doubt the feeling would be going away anytime soon. At first, he had thought it was a sign from the gods that he was making a tragic mistake, but he quickly dismissed that notion as folly. He had felt a similar tightening in his gut when he decided to pursue the lovely, raven-haired Leela, and that had turned out to be one of the greatest choices in his life. No, he was certain that this decision was the right one. As he stared out at the horizon, watching the fiery red and orange remnants of the sun retreat once again to its place of slumber, somewhere beyond the mountains to the west, past the point of what was known, he realized that he was right. In that moment, there was no uncertainty, no second guesses, and no remorse. Only a small knot of fear remained, but it was not enough to deter him. The decision was made. There would be no going back. Come morning, before the sun rose over the smaller mountains that encircled the valley he called home, he would be gone. He had written a farewell letter to his family and friends and planned to leave the parchment on the family table, where he knew it would be discovered when his mother began preparations for the morning meal. By the time his family knew of his plan, it would be too late to stop him. As the final flicker of light disappeared, Kelvin felt tiny hands tug at him from behind. "Time to eat," he heard his younger sister Kara tell him in that sing-song way she had that made every word out of her mouth sound like laughter. "Come now, now!" He was surprised that she had been able to approach without his hearing her. Her favorite pastime was to come up behind people as silently impossible and startle them. Most of the time she was unsuccessful, but she was getting better at it. Their mother now expected Kara to jump out from her at every shadow after an early morning surprise several days prior. Kelvin relented with a laugh and scooped his darling little sister up in his powerful hands and tickled her belly as he carried her back to the cottage they called home. Her infectious barks of giggling laughter echoed through the night, growing louder and louder. He would miss young Kara the most. Family meal was a tradition in the Kelvins' home. Every night the entire family would gather and spend time together. As usual, Mother had cooked up a feast worthy of a land baron's mansion instead of a farmer's modest cottage. The heavy wooden table that Father's father had made with his own hands long ago was overloaded with so much food that Kelvin sometimes feared it might snap into kindling under the weight of it all. The sweet aromas of his mother's recipes mingled in the air and made his entire home smell delicious. Knowing that it might be the last meal prepared by his mother that he might ever eat, Kelvin savored every bite and even went back for seconds. Father sat at his traditional place at the head of the table and held court over Kelvin, his mother, his three older brothers, Vina, Marn, and Kelt, and his two sisters, Vala, who was older than everyone except Vina, with Kara as the youngest. Father asked each of them in turn, from the oldest to the youngest, about their day. Every one of them took their turn, including the youngest among them. Surprisingly, little Kara had some of the best stories, although she tended to take a long time getting to the point she was trying to make. Father was an excellent listener, and as each child spoke, they knew that they had his full, undivided attention. The three oldest boys usually had the least to say, since they spent all day working in the fields of the family farm with Father, but they all told tales of their day just the same for the rest of the family. No doubt they spoke of things throughout the day, but somehow they made working the farm sound interesting. Kelvin's oldest sister, Vala, worked as an aide to one of the matriarchs of the valley's lone village, which was just a short trip away by horse. Vala's duties for the matriarch, whom she called Miss Ella, varied from day to day, so the family always enjoyed listening to her stories. Today, Vala had accompanied the matriarch into the hills, where she met with the hill people to discuss the option of building a dam to store a reservoir of water for the valley and the hill people to use as needed. Vala was confident that negotiations were successful and that construction would begin soon. This news excited Kelvin's brothers, who were also eager to take on new challenges, especially if it brought them a small reprieve from the harsh reality of working the family farm. Like his sister, Kelvin also worked in the village. His job, however, was nowhere near as glamorous as hers seemed to be. Kelvin served as apprentice to Devak Major, the village historian. Kelvin was learning the history of the village and was assisting the historian in creating a new map of the valley, including the sections of the mountains and hills that surrounded the village. During the past months, they had traveled extensively as they mapped every path, trail, and home in the valley. It was an enormous task, but it was nearing completion. Kelvin probably knew the valley better than even his father or his father before him. Kelvin's studies of the valley's history had turned up some very intriguing information. Although it was commonly accepted that no one ever left the valley, with only a handful of exceptions, no one had in several generations. Kelvin found documentation of ancient explorers who had braved the journey over the horizon to see what was out there. Unlike those who later followed in their footsteps, these explorers were hailed as brave heroes as opposed to brain-damaged heretics as they were today. Unfortunately, none of those who had gone over the horizon had ever returned. Those who stayed behind took this as a sign from their deities that leaving the valley was dangerous, and that they were better off staying put to live out the life that had been graciously given to them by their ever-benevolent gods. Those who left were deemed deviants and never spoken of again except as object lessons to the next wandering soul who felt the call of the unknown. Kelvin was one such wandering soul. After making his astonishing discovery, Kelvin had naturally told his family during evening meal. To his surprise, not only did his family dismiss the notion of leaving the valley as dangerous, but Father had commented on how foolhardy it all sounded. He said that such a thing was something only someone without a dollop of common sense would ever conceive. I have everything I need here, he said as a matter of fact. For what reason would I ever want to leave the village? That night, while lying in his bed and staring at the ceiling while listening to his brother snore, Kelvin made his decision. He would do it, if only to prove to his father that it could be done. He was going over the mountains and beyond the horizon. He had to know what, if anything, was out there. Kelvin dressed quickly in the dark. He had stared at the ceiling in the room he shared with his brothers all night. He had hoped to get some sleep, but he was too excited to begin his journey, so the peace of dreaming eluded him. Adrenaline coursed through his body. He was ready to go, and the hour of his departure drew nearer. His excitement grew. He paused at the door and took a last look at the family room. He hoped that he would be able to return home after he found that which he sought, but he understood that he may never make it back this way again. As he closed the door behind him, his only thought was that someday his family would understand why he had to leave. With only the stars and a copy of the map he had made of the mountains to the west as his guide, Kelvin stepped off the family farm into the night. The unknown answered him. Since he had made the decision to go, Kelvin had mapped out the path he would take in great detail. He knew the way so well he could walk it with his eyes closed, or in the dark. He knew that if he were to use a torch, then he would be spotted and possibly pursued and dragged back to face his father's disappointment. Neither of those options were particularly appealing, so he moved on in the dark, slowly and carefully measuring each step and handhold as he began to climb. The climb was difficult but manageable. Kelvin had been climbing these rocky paths since he was able to walk. Despite traveling by starlight, he made it to the top just as the sun began its rise from behind the eastern hills behind him. He stood atop the highest rock he could find and watched as the deep purples and reds brightened until only brilliant blue remained. The valley looked so beautiful in the morning light, especially from above, and Kelvin felt the first pangs of sadness for leaving. As the farm beasts began to stir below, Kelvin turned his back on everything he'd ever known and started down the mountain into the unknown. After the fourth sunset, Kelvin was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake. He had been walking for days and had yet had yet to see much of anything. There were rocks and plants, grass and dirt, all things he had seen before. Disappointment began to creep in on him. He was so certain that he would find something wonderful and exciting, but so far there was nothing. How could I have been so wrong? He mumbled. He found a stream and made camp for the night. As he sat next to the fire and stared up at the sky above, he thought about going back and wondered what his family must think of him. He missed them, especially young Kara. If he returned, would they welcome him back with open arms, he wondered, or would they turn him away? The thought of it scared him. He decided he would give it just one more day. If he did not find anything by the next sundown, he would turn around and go back home. The next morning, Kelvin started out on the last jet leg of his journey. He walked with purpose. If he was going to find something, it had to be today. Despite making no discoveries, he remained convinced that there was something out there, just beyond the horizon. He knew it. He felt it. Kelvin prayed that he would find it. As the sun began its downward trajectory, racing the determined young man toward the horizon, Kelvin felt his hopes begin to fade. He saw a hill ahead of him, not quite as high as those that surrounded his home valley, but they stretched toward the heavens. From atop there, he would get a good look at the land surrounding him. Maybe from there he could see what was out there. If he planned to follow his self-imposed deadline, he would have to hurry to reach the hills before nightfall. He picked up the pace. The climb was not a difficult one, but it took him longer to reach the peak than he had guessed. It was dark by the time he reached the top. Once he was there, however, he knew it was worth every ounce of sweat the climb had taken out of him, for the sight he beheld made his spirit soar. Not far away, he could see the twinkling lights of a sprawling city. It was much larger than the tiny village he had called home. Kelvin was so excited that he wanted to run down the mountain, but common sense prevailed. Trying to traverse the unfamiliar in the dark was restless at best. The smart thing to do was to wait until the sun came up before making the journey, so he made camp. Come morning, Kelvin was on the move. By midday, he reached the edge of the wondrous city. It stretched out before him as far as the eye could see. The dwellings were larger than those he knew, some reaching as much as 3 or 4 stories high. The streets were full of people walking and milling about, some selling their wares, while others simply tried to navigate their way through the crowd. Kelvin had never before seen so many people gathered in one place as he walked into the market. The sensation and mixture of exotic smells in the air threatened to overwhelm him. He stopped at one of the stands that was filled with various fruits and vegetables of all sizes and colors. Most of them he recognized, but there were a few the likes of which he had never seen before. "Good day, my friend," the man working the stand said, all smiles. "Good day to you as well," Kelvin said as he returned the smile. The seller motioned toward the delicious display in front of him. "What looks good to you today, my good man?" "Everything," Kelvin said as he picked up a Jumac pear and handed over a couple of coins he had brought with him. "An excellent choice," the seller said as he took the coins and looked at them. A look passed across the man's face that made Kelvin stop before taking a bite of his purchase. "Is something the matter?" he asked. "What kind of currency is this?" He held it up to the light for a better look. "I've never seen anything like it." "Oh." Kelvin's cheeks flushed red. "I'm not from here. I'm just passing through. I came from the village." "Village?" "Yes, sir. It's just over those mountains there," he said, pointing toward the direction he'd come. "About 5 days' walk." "Who knew there was anything out there?" "Well, it's a small farming village, but it's home." "And what brings you to our fair city?" "Exploring," Kelvin said. "Maybe you can help me." "Perhaps." "Are there other cities like this one? Do you know what lies beyond the city limits?" He said skeptically, as if he couldn't believe someone had actually asked such a ridiculous question. "How would I know what is out there?" "Aren't you curious? Do you not travel?" "I have everything I require right here," the seller said flatly. "For what reason would I ever need to leave the city?" Kelvin was taken aback at the echo of his father's words was thrown back at him. He couldn't speak, didn't know what to say, so he ran. He ran and did not stop until he was well clear of the market. He had hoped that the people here would be different, but he could see that these people lacked an adventurous spirit, much the same as those in the village. It saddened him. Kelvin spent 4 glorious days in the city, taking in everything he could and enjoying the exotic flavors the city had to offer. On the 5th day, he knew it was time to move on, so he packed and had a bag and headed toward the city limit to the east. He would continue walking toward the horizon. There had to be more out there for him to see. There simply had to be. And he would find it, even if it took the rest of his life. Kara stared out at the horizon and felt a knot in her stomach tighten. It was not a new sensation. The knot first made its presence felt the day after her brother left. It had been many days since she discovered Kelvin's note on the family's meal table, but she still returned to this spot every day and scanned the horizon for some sign, some glimpse of her brother. So far, she had found none. Although she no longer cried herself to sleep at night, Kara remained sad most of the time. Happiness returned to her life in small doses, but she knew the emptiness of Kelvin's absence would always remain with her. Her father no longer spoke of his rebellious son after condemning the boy's adventurous spirit for making his mother sad. He would never admit it aloud, but she knew father missed Kelvin almost as much as she did. Kara could not understand her family's attitude. She understood why her brother did what he did, for she too shared his wandering soul and adventurous spirit, but she would not share that information with her family. Kara smiled as she watched the sun set beyond the horizon. She still missed Kelvin and always would. She knew he was out there somewhere and hoped that one day they would be reunited. Perhaps one day I'll follow him, she thought, but could never say so aloud. And then I'll see what lies beyond the horizon. The end. And that story is called Beyond the Horizon, which appears in 85 North, which is published by Falstaff Books. You can find this online. Amazon has paperback and ebook copies. You can find links to it at my website, bobbynash.com, as well as falstaffbooks.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. Have a great day.